Well, thanks. It's great to be here. My wife and I stopped by the museum about a week after I got invited to talk, back last fall. The last day it was open, as it turned out. So it's fun to be back and to get to talk about something that I haven't talked about for a while. My entree into children's history was the Civil War. I wrote a book about children during the Civil War. 27 years ago, weirdly. I'm only 40. I don't know how that happened, but I think some of you might identify with that. Anyway, and I've explored various kinds of children's history over time. And what I want to kind of make clear, I'm actually talking about childhood tonight more than children. Children are a biological fact. There's always been children. You can kind of identify, if we saw a picture of a child from 200 BC, that looks like a kid. Now their lives are going to be really different. And one of the things that is a term that historians like to use is construction. Childhood is a construction, meaning it can mean different things at different times. I think even in our day and age, if you live in a different country, you have a different religion, if you're a different gender, if you're a different political system, children have different expectations and different things are expected of them. I grew up in South Dakota in the 50s and 60s, and a farm kid was different than a town kid. I was a town kid who worked on farms, so it was kind of in between. I didn't start working when I was 7. I started working when I was 12, out on farms. But most of my classmates were driving a tractor when they were 7 or 8. So, I mean, even that little simple example, which are there you can identify with, I'm sure there are different childhoods with lots of variables. But what I want to talk about tonight is something that was happening when this house was built, when the first agent and his wife and their various servants and so forth lived here. Something going on, it was the invention of childhood. Now again, there had been childhood. People thought about children going back to the Romans, and before that there were child advice books, in the Middle Ages. They're different than ours, but they thought about childhood, mainly for the elites, mainly for rich people and the nobles. But it's not that people didn't think about childhood. But what we would recognize as childhood starts to emerge during the time this house was being built and lived in by and surrounded by tons of children, I found out just a few minutes ago, actually. And so I want to talk about the ways that in the New Republic, that's the time period we're talking about here, kind of overlaps the Jacksonian 1930s. But if you're a historian, you refer to from the time of really after the Revolution, the Constitution, up to the 1820s or so is the New Republic. And it's when ideas about what government should be, what the Republic should look like, working out some of the powers of the presidency and Congress. Not that ever happens again. Anyway, but how to think about the United States is also coinciding with how to think about childhood. What children should be educated to be, what their responsibility and role might be in this new republic, and what the family should look like. And so by the end, we're going to be talking about really the invention of the modern family. And I think by modern family, you'll recognize it. It's childhood rather. Extended, innocent, protected. That's what we think of childhood being. And I'll get to what that really means in the end. But that's where we're headed with this. And it's just starting to come out about this time. Not that parents hadn't always wanted to protect their children, but it becomes more of a moral responsibility and more possible during this time. So, two things going on in these illustrations. This is from 1787. I don't know if you can read this. This is my great color for what I was trying to do. Columbia presents 2 children to the goddess of wisdom. Columbia, of course, is the gem of the ocean, but also the symbol for the United States. And 1787 is when the Constitution is written. It's not put into effect for a couple of years. But it indicates the importance of children, or grooming is a different word nowadays than it was then, but grooming children to be Republicans. And by Republican, of course, we don't mean a political party, we mean a way of thinking about government, a small r, meaning a representative, not a democracy. It's got democratic institutions, but it's a republic. Representatives are acting in your stead, and we rely on them to be virtuous. Now, virtue in this case means not interested in their own well-being, disinterested, thinking about the public good. And that's always been has been ever since our model of a public servant. You know, that's the big debate with everybody, you know, not just now, but going back 200 years. And so children needed to be raised to be virtuous so they could be good voters and responsible citizens. And so this is, again, Columbia presenting two children, I think, to be made wise by the goddess of wisdom. They're not already wise. They're on the way. They don't look very wise. They look a little shy, a little, you know, concerned there. Now, another context of which this house is a huge part is this other picture. Have you ever seen this painting? It's from the 1870s. It's in a lot of textbooks. I bet you have seen it, actually. I'm going to guarantee some of you have seen it. It's called American Progress. And again, here's Columbia. She features in both. And again, I don't know if you can make this out or not, but the easiest thing to see are the trains, right? Over here. So that's the last part. This is, again, 1870 something is when this is painted. Can you tell what's going on over here in the dark side of the painting? Indians scurrying into the mountains, into the wilderness, into the darkness that is uncivilized. So they're being conquered eventually. There's a couple of different kinds. The bison are being chased off in the dark. They're going to be going back to Europe. Not quite the 1870s, but in the 80s, they're largely gone in this part of the country, certainly, in the plains especially. But you have prospectors, you have stagecoaches, you have farmers, you have the Pony Express, you have Columbia stringing telegraph wires, carrying logs in her hand, or a textbook. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. And farmers plowing the ground. This is progress for white Americans. It's why this house is here, is to create that kind of progress. This is a meeting point of this and this in many ways. And so inventing childhood during this time means creating a new kind of childhood, but a new kind of citizen, a new kind of country in many ways. And so these things are coming together in the 1830s in ways that wouldn't have been recognizable in the 1760s or in Europe at this time. So it's probably important to indicate what childhood was like. Things that, yes, I have a very important thing to say, so we'll hear that little note every time I have been putting that down. It does sound like an asterisk, doesn't it? Children didn't go to school after the age of 12, rich or poor. And so that's kind of just the key thing I want to say. Childhood is very short. Now, a few people, tiny number of people, would have gone to academies. The first high school was actually created in the 1820s in Boston. I think there's a school that still says it's that school, you know. And so high schools start popping up here and there. There's the first high school in Milwaukee, I think, is in the late 1850s, or maybe right after the Civil War. It will not be until after World War II that a majority of Americans graduate from high school. They go to high school for a while, but they don't necessarily graduate. And so we kind of think that being this well, of course that is 80 years ago. Anyway, we think that as being kind of a constant, and it's not. It's a very unusual thing to go past 11 or 12 years old. And so most children had to find something to do. Now, if you're living on a plantation in South Carolina, you're probably just hanging around the house and bossing slaves around. That's too general and kind of glib. But if you're a middle-class person in Boston, it's going to be a different thing too. If you're a farmer, like farmers anywhere, you're going to be put to work doing what you're able to do based on your strength and what you're expected as a boy or a girl and so forth. So that starts to change. Not so much the education part, that changes very, very slowly. But with the invention of the Republic comes a new conception of childhood that requires children to be better educated. Now these are just pictures from McGuffey readers. One of the first things that new Republicans want to do is to kind of make education more regular. Before the 1830s, there was no Department of Education, certainly, but no state education departments. There were county school boards, or more like a township. I mean, townships are what schools are based on, out here at least. A township is 16 square miles, I think, and one section of that is for the school. Certainly out in South Dakota was even more grid-like than here. You know, the township school was at a certain place. Through the 1970s, really, there were still a few of those schools. But there were no regulations. And so one of the things that in certain states, beginning in the 1820s and 30s, and if you've heard of any education before, you've heard of Horace Mann. Every big city has a school named after Horace Mann. My sister taught in Sioux Falls, South Dakota at Horace Mann School. And his notion was to, and he was a state legislator in Massachusetts, and a teacher, is to have some rules. And so instead of having a teacher wander into town, put an ad in the paper, say, I'm going to have a term of school for the next 12 weeks. You actually have a 12-week term set by law. And you have teachers that have a certain kind of education. If not education, at least a certificate saying that they've been tested or approved or certified, by the county or township school board. They have a kind of standardized text. Now again, the McGuffey readers aren't first grade, second grade, third grade. They are the first, second, third, fourth reader. So you just whip through them at your own speed, basically. And when we talk about having reform school, we're not talking about having 8 grades. We're having one school, one house, one built room. I believe there's the old school in Fort Winnebago over there. I went to a 2-room schoolhouse for my first 4 years. And it was the same deal. We had one teacher for 4 grades. There were 9 of us in the 4 grades, more or less. My mom was the only kid in her class for 8 grades in country school. So she was the top student. She was the prettiest, she was the smartest. They actually voted on this, and she won every election. Anyway, so it wasn't like they're coming up with schools we would identify with. They're coming up with ideas about schools that we would identify with. And the point here is to make a literate, and you wouldn't use the term critical thinking, but it's kind of what they're thinking about, so that they can be virtuous Republicans. They can read the paper, they can listen to speeches by candidates, they can vote for someone who have their best interests, the voters' best interests in mind. And so that's a very almost pie in the sky sort of attitude, but it is kind of what we still think, about education, right? And about politicians and voting. And so this is when it's coming to the fore, when it's really being created. And it's being created in the hearths and homes, I'll try to say that as often as I can tonight, of Americans all over the country. And so publicly supported education is important, standardized education, education to citizenship was very part of this invention of childhood. Now, there was a very emotional element to this as well. These are both by a painter named Lily Martin Spencer, who did lots of these domestic paintings. This is from the 1840s, this is from the 1860s. And this, I think, indicates what we're talking about when we talk about innocent, extended, protected childhood. Now, one of the things that begins happening in the 1820s is that families start getting somewhat smaller. especially among middle-class families. In fact, I should back up. The middle class is also growing this time. By middle class, we mean kind of what we would imagine. I think our modern middle class is pretty hard to define sometimes. We're all middle class, you know, in many ways. But by this, we mean like shopkeepers, foremen in factories. Doctors and lawyers are not the big deals they are to us these days, but they are still professionals. Teachers are almost professionals this time. But because the economy is growing, the middle class is growing. And it's the middle class which is kind of where, in those hearths and homes, where this notion of childhood is really taking off. Middle class families can have a little more room, and then they're going to have fewer. And we're talking about going from 7 kids to 4. It's not that's I made those numbers up. That's more or less, you know, what we're talking about. So what does that do for a family? I mean, some of you probably had a number of kids or were part of families with many kids. We have 2 kids. We have 1 grandchild. We have each 1 sister. I have 1 nephew. We have tiny families. I have friends that had 12 siblings, you know, in my class. And so they have who knows how many nieces and nephews. And so it's still lots of variety, you know, in sizes. But generally speaking, families have gotten smaller over the years. There was a blip in the 50s. There really was a major blip in the 50s. But still, families just got smaller over time. And so when you have fewer children, the logic is you can spend more time with individual children. I mean, if you had more than 1 child, you know, when you had that 1, it was easier than when you had both at the same time. Now, ours are 8 years apart, so we have 2 only children, kind of. But fewer children mean more time for the children, more resources for each child. There's also, they're usually going to be closer together. So instead of having babies over 25 years, you have babies over 7 years. So you're not pregnant all the time, or just having had a baby all the time, which means better health for the mothers, because it's dangerous to have babies. I think it's dangerous any time, but it's really dangerous at a time when there's no C-sections, there's no medication for infections. They can't do, they have no idea what's going on. You know, that's not quite true, but very little. No, doctors really can't do anything for you, no matter what you have, but certainly not for having a child. So it's great for mothers' health to have fewer children in the 19th century, certainly. And you can have more stuff. And so middle class have more resources. And you have, this is from 1847, and this is so idealistic. You know, it's got the 6-month-old, you got the 2 or 3-year-old, not even that probably. They are all but, you know, going like, you know, they actually are doing this at their babies. They clearly have resources and money, and they could not love those children more. Now, they don't love their children more than parents did in 1650 or 1350. They have time to love them more. They have more time to give them. And what's important is society begins to expect that of parents. It's starting to turn, and I think it varies from generation. I think my parents would say, oh, back when I was a kid in the 1930s and 1930s and 40s, people didn't think about kids very much. But boy, when you kids, you know, every generation, I think, feels like they had it harder than their kids' generation. I'm not sure that's true, but they think it, I think. But this is clearly the idealized version of a hearth and home featuring these young children who will be brought up with resources and protection and innocence and made into perfect little Americans, which maybe these are even the same kids, the same painter. They've had another kid. This is during the Civil War. It's one of my favorite pictures from when I did work in the Children's Civil War. It's actually called News from Vicksburg, I think. Vicksburg is one of the big victories for the Union Army. There's a lot going on in this painting. One thing, I don't know how in the world that baby is staying in that lap. You see where that hand is? 3rd, 4th kid, you know, whatever. That's got to be it. Anyway, and so she's reading the news, and here's the oldest, has made a soldier's hat, kind of a Napoleonic soldier's hat, but anyway, he's got kind of a uniform on. It's the wrong color, but he's got a uniform. The second oldest, a little girl, has, you can't quite tell, this is like a Civil War, the kepi, the forage cap. That's pretty familiar. If you see any picture about Civil War soldiers, they have this cap on. It's actually got, I think it's a red diamond, which is the divisional patch for probably a brother, an older brother or uncle or father, probably, is off in the Army. Again, if any of you are veterans, you know, your units have patches of various kinds. The Screaming Eagles, if you're, is it the 101st or 82nd or 101st? And all divisions have some kind of symbol, and this is the same sort of thing. I think actually the corps is the diamond, the red is the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd division of that corps. Anyway, and she's got a drum, she's banging in a pan. This little boy has just a bag on his head, but he's actually got a rucksack. You know, I think it's just like is a duffel bag basically, but they seem to have pillaged their father's stuff when he's home on leave or something, I don't know. And they're marching around and celebrating in this really nice house. Look at the china back here, and they've got a servant. Something else that, you know, any middle-class family could have. The servants were really cheap. And this is a little inside baseball. This is in the Civil War lecture, but she's not very happy because she's Irish. And the Irish are Democrats. The Irish don't care about slaves. And that's kind of what's going on in the background here. There are tons of Irish in the Union Army, so I don't want to exaggerate that, but that's kind of like her. But or else she's upset because maybe her husband got killed. Who knows? You know, at Vicksburg. But both of these show, I think, a childhood with stuff, with children being the center of attention, which is a version of this new childhood. And certainly show them being engaged in their heart, in their home, with politics, with what's going on in the bigger world. And they're expected to be engaged in that bigger world, whether it's war or it's something else. I think even better version of this. This is called Young America. One of the things that a term used a lot in the period of the New Republic, Jackson America, even later. Young America meaning both the country, being a young country. If you've seen Hamilton, they talk about that a lot, you know, being a young Americans, young country, young, the whole song about Theodora, you know, and the little girls being born and the son being born, and coming up with the country and so forth. This shows it in action. So the previous picture just had kids prancing around because they have this vague notion of a battle being won. This guy's giving a speech. This is an election going on or something. I don't know who exactly he's campaigning for. They're not all paying attention, obviously. And again, there's a lot going on here. You have, he's probably a slave, I don't know. African American at least, working class. This looks like a boatman. He's got the stocking cap thing. So there's lots of types here, you know, in this picture. But this little boy is, and here's a state house over here. This is what politicians look like in these cartoons and these paintings. So he's probably making some sort of shady deal. But children more or less participated in politics. Now again, this says a lot is about society as well, because there's a lot of class things going on. Someone has spilled apples. I don't know. I think maybe these guys picked on him. I don't know. There's just, again, a lot going on. The fact that a painter is painting this says something about ideas about childhood, that they're worth studying as subjects of art. As representatives of something going on in society. And so, this is Thomas Leclerc, is his name. This is 1863. So, this is during the Civil War as well. So, a paradox of all this, actually, put these in the wrong order, is that even as this notion of childhood being extended, protected, innocent, is developing, there's a whole class of children that have nothing to do with that. And of course, these are slave children. That's far away from here. There aren't officially slaves in Wisconsin. There are certainly African Americans who were slaves somewhere else and may have been brought to the Northwest Territory as slaves or indentured servants. You mentioned there was someone who kind of transitioned to this, which is, it's not like being a slave. You don't own, you own their labor, not their body, if you're an indentured servant. And this is an age-old way of organizing labor. But slavery was the huge irony during this time in which childhood is being invented. Because there was no childhood for a slave. Now, having said that, there are still children who are slaves. And many of them remembered in their old age having a childhood where they played, where they didn't have any responsibility, where they felt somewhat free. I didn't know I was a slave. Now, I'm referring to, again, a little bit inside baseball, but there's a thing called the slave narratives, which are oral histories taken in the 1930s. Have you heard of these? As part of the Writers Project and the WPA, the New Deal. And they're about, 2,500, 3,200, a bunch of them were taken in all the states. Southern states, like Indiana as well, Kentucky, there's some in New Jersey maybe. I mean, places where there were a lot of people that had been slaves. And so they are a wonderful resource for sort of the voices of slaves. I have to be very careful with them. They're being interviewed by white people in the depths of depression in the Ku Klux Klan South. And they are often saying what they think the white people want to hear. Now, having said that, I've read all of them. And there's like 18 volumes, 20 volumes of, about like this. They're just published like those transcripts. They're online actually for the most part now. They say some really awful things happen to them. They talk a lot about punishment, they talk a lot about religion, they talk about ghosts, because African Americans and slaves are supposedly superstitious and think about ghosts a lot. They do talk about the Klan sometimes. But still, you have very poor people who are very old. Again, they were slaves, they're in 1938. So the youngest ones are going to be late 70s. They barely remember anything. And this is also about being free after the war, too. So it's not just about slavery. The really annoying thing is that these white folks that are transcribing, and some of them are recorded, but most are just transcribed, try to recreate the dialect. Have you ever read a Southern dialect? Have you read Huckleberry Finn? Mm-hmm. It's really annoying, right? Triple or quadruple that for these. They try to spell out, and I think it's a Southern accent they're trying to spell out, basically. They're dropping all the G's, and the B's become B's, and it's really, it's hard to read. Unless, like in a few places in Florida, you had an African American interviewing, they don't try it at all. This is a bit like Mark Twain there. They try to give a little hit. Anyway, that's kind of a side point. But these sources give us a sense of what a slave childhood was like. Now, you could only work a certain amount when you were 3 years old. And you probably didn't work at all when you were 3. There was actually on a big plantation, the majority of slaves lived on big plantations. The majority of slave owners lived on small farms, but the majority of slaves lived on big plantations. So they had a little daycare with the older slaves taking care of them, or the older girls especially. When they became 4, 5, 6, they were pretty what they called the brush gang. They pulled weeds. They cleaned up the yard. They did little chores around the house. They became, as they were called, full hands, meaning they got a full ration and went out to the fields. Again, most slaves are field hands, picking cotton or working on a tobacco farm or whatever. when they were 10 to 12, depending on, I think boys probably went out a little early. Girls went out slightly after that. So by the time they were 11 or 12, they were full-fledged slaves. Now again, if you're a white kid living on a farm, you're probably working when you're 12 too. Very different, obviously, and your living conditions are going to be very different, and nobody owns your body. And you're living with surviving relatives. Slave children don't necessarily live with relatives. Usually there's somebody on a plantation they're related to. But families are constantly being broken up. It's kind of the main criticism, actually, of slavery in the 1820s and 30s is that it breaks up families. It's wrong as well, but the reason it's really wrong to abolitionists is that it ruins families. And so this notion of a protected childhood, of course, is out the window. Extended, well, there is a period of childhood, but it's really short. And you're integrated more fully into work much sooner. And there's no educating you to becoming a voter. What you are educated to is to become a slave. Or, I don't mean that necessarily, I mean, often the owners are training you to do certain jobs, or the older slaves are. They're also, however, and this isn't meant to minimize slavery at all, to teach them to be safe as slaves. Don't work too hard or they'll give you more to do. Don't talk back, but here's ways to maintain your dignity. And really more importantly, slave religion becomes a way that parents and elders, aunts and uncles as they call anybody older than them basically, is a way to teach young slaves to resist at least mentally and spiritually. The religion that slaves are taught by whites, and they, if you a big plantation might have a white minister come preach every Sunday, is the New Testament. Turn the other cheek, obey your masters. Pay unto Rome what is Rome's. Your reward comes after you die, right? Now that's a very, very lightweight version of what Jesus is trying to say, but that's what Christianity given to slaves suggests. The Christianity that slaves, and they adapt Christianity and sometimes they combine it with other things. This is the Old Testament. An eye for an eye. Exodus. There are the Jews. And they will someday escape. And they will resist. And anybody who owned a slave will go to hell. It's not a crime to kill a slave owner. I mean, they have a completely different set of moral and this is almost political ideas that are passed along to their children. So I don't want to get too caught up in this. This has nothing to do with this house. This is one of the very, it's a terrible picture, right? It's too big. These are slave children. These are actually slaves, I believe. This is taken before the Civil War. Picking cotton. And there's an adult. This is, I don't know, this looks like maybe like a 12-year-old to me, maybe 10. And this is a pretty little kid out there. Now, cotton's picking season is kind of long, but it's a harvest season, so more people are put to work. You can work longer during that time, like any harvest season. So I don't doubt. And look how big this basket is. I mean, this is her waist. You know, that's a big basket of cotton. This is a slave quarter, like a really nice one. This is a one-room cabin with a chimney and a floor. It's up off the ground. Most are going to have dirt floors and no windows. So I don't know who. This is clearly a slave owner trying to impress people. You know, with how rich he is because he can build these slave cabins. This is from the Civil War period, and this is a slave auction. And you can't. I don't know if you can tell this or not. This is the slave auctioneer. These are the adults being sold. Here are their children crying on the steps because they're probably going to be separated. There's no laws against that. There's certain assumptions about not before they're 6, you know, or not their mother. It's okay for their father, you know, pretty lame, you know, rules, but they'll be separated. I'll just mention this. These are slave children in New Orleans just after the Civil War, former slave children. And it's a postcard that was put out by abolitionists and it was showing, so here's a dark-skinned, African-American boy. This little girl is also a former slave, and she's very white. One of the things that slavery does is not only to break up slave families, but because so often slave women were raped and abused by white men, there's lots of white kids who are slaves, or part white, and so that's the point of this. And again, indicating, this little house is like the best you can expect for a hearth. This is another example of a home being broken up, as is a slave auction. So the lives of slaves, the childhoods of slaves, ideas about them are very different than we might imagine. And this is not news to you, I don't believe, but it is an irony of what's going on before. I also want to mention another kind of, it's kind of projecting a little bit, but childhood on the frontier, which is going to be different. Again, this is the frontier when the house is built. These pictures are from the far west, like the Great Plains, and probably farther west than that even. Don't know what's going on, but well, I know what's going on. I don't think those two turkeys can really pull that many watermelon, but anyway, it's a colorized picture, and says this little girl has quite the dress on, out there. Like you have a little toy wagon, basically, and again, you have pet turkeys. You must be pretty well off. The frontier gave children a certain amount of freedom, even as they were expected to work. And so as you go west, I think this emergence of modern childhood is delayed by a generation or two as you go west. Again, it's kind of the rural element of it, I think. You have kids in country schools. This is from this is like 1900, I think, in North Dakota. And that is how you salute the flag back then, by the way. They aren't young Nazis. It really is the normal way you salute the flag probably until the Nazis, I don't know. But I've seen a number of pictures like that. And they're doing that's the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't know what they're doing exactly, because that didn't exist yet when those kids existed. And you have this very extended family, and there's really big sod house back here. And so frontier families are going through some of the same things, and they are being brought up to be young Republicans as well in the 1860s and 70s and 80s and into the 20th century in some places. And the same standards apply in terms of coming up with or making them into responsible Americans. I think it probably for most Westerners, education is important, and so these township schools are important. And by this time, territories and states are requiring a certain amount of schooling. It's probably going to be about 3 months a year. I'm just guessing. It varies a lot. Mainly in the winter, because you need the kids at home in the winter, in the fall to harvest, and in the spring to do those chores. Or you have the terrible weather. Sometimes the winter can keep that from happening. But you do have school is very important. You have to go at least till 8th grade, I suppose. I think most states that put in laws about schooling probably get you through grade 8, maybe 14. You can stop going to school then. Not that you necessarily do, but you can stop at that point. But they're growing up with the country too. As the country moves west, as Manifest Destiny, that picture that I showed you earlier, expands the places where children are populating and becoming the population for the new America. I forgot to mention, about half of all slaves are under the age of 16. So this is a very young population. It's something like half on western states too, for children. Families are bigger in the west than they are in the east, for instance. And so this is going on at a later time than this house was built. But I can't help but think there was certainly an element of this frontier experience in Wisconsin. Certainly if you read Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House in the Big Woods, that's the 1860s. And you get that sense. When I was going to my two-room schoolhouse in Badger, South Dakota, the county seat of our county was DeSmet, which is the little town on the prairie, where, and then the long winter took place there, and Silver Lake is right there, and so I kind of claim Laura Ingalls Wilder as a relative, kind of, not really, but anyway. And so Western children are having some similar assumptions, but very different kinds of experiences as they grow into adulthood. I do want to touch on Native American children as well, because some of the same, and not as Native children, but more as what white Americans think should happen to them. These are actually Apache children, but they are a great example of expectations when children are sent off to boarding schools. And most Native children did not go to boarding schools. They did go to reservation schools run by religious organizations quite often. The boarding schools have gotten a lot of attention because they were sites of abuse, and you have Carlisle in Pennsylvania and in Virginia. It was also a school for former slaves, and is now something else. In Norfolk, I think Norfolk State might be how it evolved into something else. But most Western states had Indian schools, and the whole point of an Indian school was to get rid of the Indianness of the students. And again, to make them into white Americans, basically. I mean, reservations were meant to turn hunters into farmers, which was easier for an Eastern tribe, which when they are actually farmers, I'm not saying it's easy, it's just they are farmers. And certainly some natives in this neck of the woods farm for part of their well-being. But when you get from here west, that's not necessarily their main way of making a living, of surviving. But it was a way that the federal government could control them, make them not a problem anymore. And so the adults were meant to be Christianized and to become farmers. The children were meant to become young adults, young Republicans. And so this is the same, I've always this is again a very famous pair of pictures. Here they are arriving, and I don't know what school it is, it's in Arizona. And there again, I said they're Apaches. They're not in the right same order, but these are the same kids. You can identify a few of them. Just the last time I was doing this, I show this my children's history class all the time. They have changed their clothes, they have short hair, they're not allowed to speak their native language. They're taught the same stuff that white kids were taught to make them citizens, but they also are required to work as part to pay off their room and board. Now, orphans have to do that in orphanages too, white orphans do. It's a very common thing in institutional life for any child during this time. But it's a way of making them into Americans. Now, it didn't work very well, in that most of them went back to reservations, and they were caught between being an Indian and an Oneida or Ho-Chunk and a white person. And it didn't go well for a lot of them. Now, some of them became teachers and lawyers and so forth and did fine. But it was an element of this notion of what childhood should be, but kind of on steroids, because you're doing it just immediately. Taken out of context, out of a hearth and a home that white kids have that would naturally create this kind of childhood, and kind of imposing it on them. It becomes a controversy within tribes, as the progressives, as white people would call them, favored having their kids educated this way. They've got to kind of go along to get along. And hopefully their kids would be better off against the traditionalists, as they were called, who didn't want to have anything to do with this dramatic imposition of a different kind of cultural understandings. So I want to close down. The Toma is where most Ho-Chunk children would have gone, who were educated, and this is a picture of that in the early 20th century. And that school went into the 1930s or 40s, I think. I went out to West River, South Dakota, and there was actually still an Indian school in Chamberlain, South Dakota, which is right on the Missouri River. A boarding school. And it's a very nice boarding school right now. It just looks like it could be any prep school, but it's for Native Americans at this time. So, well, I want to end by saying everything I've said applies to a tiny fraction of children. I've always said that the modern concept of childhood applied to a majority of American children for about 5 minutes in 1954. It's a model, it's a standard. These are all from about the same time period. These are, I think these kids work in coal mines. They look pretty clean for coal miners, but Jacob, this is a picture from Jacob Reese, I believe, who went around taking pictures of city kids. This is a family of children and adults working in a tenement in New York. And this is my favorite picture, kids playing in a gutter by a dead horse. Don't know what's going on there. This is probably this because I think these are cars back here, at least one of them is. They might be wagon, I'm not positive, they might be wagon in a car. But they're kind of on their own, don't know where this little kid's going, no one's watching out for him. I mean, this is a childhood that existed for centuries after, not centuries, decades after what I'm talking about. It still exists, obviously, for some children. And so what I've been trying to talk about here tonight is not something that I think happened. It is still in process. Every generation tries to invent childhood. But they come back to this model, this standard. We measure people against that standard. Are they on welfare? Yes, but they've got to match these standards. Is that country civilized? Well, their children aren't treated this way. I mean, these things are applied to other populations and our own all the time. And it begins in the 1830s. And that's what I've got for you. Thanks for coming.